Ethan Whitfield was 7 years old the night his entire town disappeared, and for 60 years afterward, not a single person believed a word he said about it. They called it his imagination. They called it grief playing tricks on a boy who'd lost everyone he loved in a single night. But Ethan never once changed his story. Not when the sheriff questioned him, not when the reporters came, not when his own foster family begged him to just let it go and move on with his life. Because Ethan knew what he saw. He knew it the way you know your own name. And now, at 67 years old, sitting alone in a farmhouse at the edge of the same woods that swallowed his childhood whole, he has finally decided to tell the whole truth, from the very beginning, before it happens to him one more time. The town was called Millbrook Hollow, tucked into a valley in the Appalachian foothills, the kind of place where everybody's porch light stayed on for everybody else's kids. 312 people lived there the week it happened. Farmers, shopkeepers, a school teacher named Ruth who taught 3 generations in the same one-room schoolhouse, a preacher named Samuel who'd buried half the town's grandparents and baptized the other half's children. It was an ordinary town in every way that mattered. Right up until the morning, a traveling salesman pulled his truck into the town square and found absolutely no one there to sell to. Not one soul. The bread was still warm in the ovens. The coffee was still hot on the stoves. But every single house stood open and empty, doors unlocked, beds unmade, as if the entire population had simply stood up in the middle of their lives and walked away without a single backward glance. Before we go any further into what happened that night, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Every single resident of Millbrook Hollow vanished that night except for one small boy, found sitting alone on the steps of the schoolhouse, wrapped in a quilt that wasn't his, staring at the empty road leading into the woods. That boy was Ethan Whitfield. When the salesman found him, Ethan wasn't crying. He wasn't scared, not in the way a child should be after losing his entire family and everyone he'd ever known. He was calm, unnervingly calm. And when the man asked him what had happened, Ethan looked up and said 5 words that would follow him for the rest of his life. He said, "They all went to answer." "Answer what?" the man asked him. "Answer who?" And Ethan said nothing else that day, not for 3 more years, no matter how many doctors, deputies, or desperate relatives tried to pull the rest of the story out of him. For 6 decades, the disappearance of Millbrook Hollow has sat unsolved in county records, filed away as an unexplained mass migration, a phrase investigators used because they had no better explanation and no bodies to prove otherwise. No graves were ever found, no remains were ever recovered. Families searching for their missing relatives eventually gave up, moved away, and let the valley grow wild over what used to be a town. But Ethan Whitfield never left. He rebuilt his grandfather's farmhouse with his own hands, right at the edge of those same woods. And he has spent 60 years waiting, watching that tree line every single night, because he is the only person left alive who understands what those 312 people actually heard, right before they walked out of their homes and were never seen again. And tonight, for the first time in his life, he is finally ready to tell someone exactly what it was. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand what kind of place Millbrook Hollow was before it. It was not a haunted place. It was not a cursed place, at least not in any way the people living there would have recognized. It was the kind of small American town that existed by the hundreds across the Appalachian Range in the middle of the last century, held together by church suppers and harvest seasons and the unspoken agreement that everyone would look out for everyone else's children. Ethan's mother, Margaret, ran the general store with his father, Walter, who had grown up on the same land his own father had farmed before him. Ethan had a grandfather, too, a quiet, weathered man named Elias Whitfield, who almost never spoke about his own childhood, and who kept a locked drawer in his writing desk that Ethan was forbidden, absolutely forbidden, from ever opening. Old Elias was the closest thing Millbrook Hollow had to a town historian, though nobody ever asked him much about the past, because there was something about the way he answered questions that made people stop asking them. He had lived in the valley his whole life, and his father before him, and if you pressed him hard enough, usually after a little too much whiskey at a wedding or a wake, he would tell you that the Hollow had a rule, an old rule, older than the church, older than the county itself. The rule was simple. After dark, if someone knocks, you do not open the door unless you already know, beyond any doubt, exactly who is standing on the other side of it. Most families in town treated it the way you treat any old superstition passed down from grandparents, something you nodded along to out of respect, without really believing it mattered. Ethan's family was one of the few that still took it seriously, because his grandfather made sure they did. Ethan loved his grandfather's stories, even the ones that scared him, and there was one in particular Elias told more than any other, usually in a low voice by the fireplace when Ethan couldn't sleep. It was the story of something the old-timers called the Ashwalker, a presence that supposedly moved through the valley on certain nights, always alone, always on foot, and always looking for a door that would open for it. The story went that the Ashwalker could not force its way into a home. It needed to be invited. And the terrible cleverness of it, the thing that made grown men in Millbrook Hollow uneasy, even decades later, was that it never knocked with a stranger's voice. It always sounded exactly like someone you loved and trusted completely, calling your name from just outside, asking to be let in from the cold. Ethan never took the story seriously as a young boy. Not really. The way children rarely take seriously the warnings that turn out to matter most. He thought it was simply one of his grandfather's tall tales, the kind every small town seems to have, meant to keep children from wandering out after dark, rather than describing anything real. He didn't notice, the way children rarely notice, the small signs that something in Millbrook Hollow had been wrong for longer than anyone wanted to admit. He didn't notice that his grandfather always checked the same 3 windows before bed. He didn't notice that his mother went quiet every year around the same date in early October. And he certainly didn't notice, in the days leading up to that night, that the dogs across the entire town had stopped barking at strangers and started barking at nothing at all, at empty roads, at closed doors, at the dark tree line beyond the fields, as if they could sense something the rest of the Hollow could not. Before we continue any further, if you're new here, welcome, and if you've been with us since the beginning, thank you for sticking around for stories like this one. The days before the disappearance were, by every account Ethan can still recall, some of the strangest of his childhood, though at the time, they simply felt like ordinary autumn days with a strange chill to them. The harvest had come in heavier than usual that year, and the whole town had gathered for a celebration in the square, the kind of night that should have been remembered fondly for decades afterward, full of fiddle music and lantern light and the smell of fresh bread. But even in the middle of that celebration, several townsfolk would later be remembered, in the sparse notes investigators eventually gathered from surrounding counties, as having mentioned an unease they couldn't quite name. The preacher, Samuel, apparently told his wife that he felt as though he were being watched from the tree line the entire evening, though he saw no one there when he looked. The schoolteacher, Ruth, kept every child seated closer to the fire than usual, and sent them all home earlier than the celebration required. And Elias Whitfield, Ethan's grandfather, did something he had never done before in Ethan's memory. He nailed the shutters of their farmhouse closed himself, by hand, 2 full days before anything happened at all. Ethan asked him why, and his grandfather gave him an answer that meant nothing to a 7-year-old boy, but would haunt him for the rest of his life. He said, "Because it's been 30 years since the last time, and 30 years is exactly how long it waits." Ethan didn't understand what it meant, not then, and when he asked what had happened 30 years before, his grandfather's face changed in a way Ethan had never seen, and he simply said, "Ask me again when you're older, if we're both still here to talk about it." That was the last real conversation Ethan ever had with his grandfather as a whole family, in a home that still had all its members inside it, and it is a conversation he has replayed in his mind every single night for 60 years since. The night it happened began like any other night in the Hollow. Supper was finished. The fire had been banked low. Ethan had been sent to bed while his parents and grandfather sat in the front room, speaking in tones too quiet for him to make out from the top of the stairs. He remembers the wind picking up outside sometime after dark, a low, steady wind that seemed to move through the valley rather than simply blow across it, carrying with it a sound he could never quite describe afterward, something between a voice and the creak of old timber. He remembers the family dog, a shepherd mix named Duke, pressing himself flat against the floorboards by Ethan's bed and refusing to move, whining low in his throat at nothing Ethan could see. And then, sometime near midnight, Ethan heard it. A knock, soft and almost polite, on the front door downstairs, and a voice, unmistakably his mother's voice, though he could hear his mother's footsteps still moving in the kitchen at that exact same moment, calling from just outside the door, asking someone, anyone, to please let her in from the cold. We'll continue this story from exactly that moment in the next section, so make sure you're subscribed and notifications are turned on, because what Ethan witnessed over the following hours is unlike anything else you'll hear in this documentary series. Ethan lay frozen at the top of the stairs, unable to move, unable to call out, listening to two voices that could not possibly both belong to his mother, existing in the same house at the same time. One voice, the real one, continued speaking quietly with his father in the kitchen, discussing nothing more dramatic than whether to bring in the last of the firewood before the weather turned. The other voice, the one outside the door, grew softer, gentler, more pleading, using words only his mother would know, a childhood nickname she called him that no one else in Millbrook Hollow had ever heard her use. Ethan wanted desperately to go downstairs and tell someone, but his grandfather's old rule rang in his ears louder than his own fear, and for reasons he still cannot fully explain even now, he stayed exactly where he was, silent, unmoving, watching the front door through the stair rails. He watched his grandfather rise from his chair near the fire and walk toward that door, not with fear on his face, but with something closer to grim recognition, the look of a man who had been expecting this exact moment his entire adult life. Elias did not open the door. Instead, he pressed his palm flat against the wood and spoke through it in a low, steady voice Ethan had never heard him use before, saying words that sounded almost like a prayer and almost like a warning in the same breath. The voice outside went quiet after that, for a long moment, long enough that Ethan allowed himself to believe it might simply be over. Then it began again, softer still. And this time it was not his mother's voice at all. It was his grandfather's own voice, calling from outside, asking to be let back into his own home. That was the moment everything in Millbrook Hollow began to change. Not with violence, not with any sound loud enough to wake a sleeping child in a neighboring house, but with something far quieter and far more devastating. Ethan heard doors opening across the valley that night, not broken open, not forced, but opened calmly from the inside, one after another, farmhouse after farmhouse, as if every single family in town had, at some point in those long dark hours, heard a voice they trusted completely asking to come in from the cold, and had simply, finally, said yes. His own front door never opened. His grandfather stood against it the entire night, one hand pressed to the wood, refusing every voice that called to him from the other side, no matter how many names it borrowed, no matter how convincing it became. Ethan does not know, even now, what it cost his grandfather to stand there through until morning. He only knows that when the sun finally rose over Millbrook Hollow, the voices outside had stopped completely, and when he crept down the stairs at first light, the front room was empty. His parents were gone. His grandfather was gone. Every house he could see from the window stood with its door hanging open to the morning air, and the entire town, all 312 people who had gone to bed the night before in their own beds, surrounded by their own families, had simply ceased to exist within it. If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, let us know down in the comments. And don't forget that subscribe button is right there waiting for you, before we move into what the investigators found in the days that followed. The traveling salesman who discovered the empty town notified the county sheriff's office by midday, and what followed was one of the strangest official investigations in the region's history, though almost none of it was ever made public in any meaningful way. Deputies arrived to find homes that showed no signs whatsoever of struggle, forced entry, or violence of any kind. Meals sat half-eaten on tables. Beds were left unmade, as though their occupants had simply risen and walked out mid-sleep. Livestock stood untended in barns, valuables sat untouched in drawers, and the only living resident anyone could locate in the entire town was a 7-year-old boy sitting on the schoolhouse steps, wrapped in a quilt he could not explain, offering only 5 words that made no sense to a single investigator who heard them. The sheriff at the time, a practical man named Harold Doyle, who had spent 30 years handling nothing more dramatic than livestock theft and the occasional bar fight, brought in state investigators within the week, and their working theories multiplied almost as quickly as they were disproven. The first theory was mass evacuation, a coordinated departure the entire town had somehow planned and executed without leaving a single witness or record behind, an idea abandoned almost immediately once investigators realized every family's savings, documents, and irreplaceable belongings had been left behind untouched. The second theory was some form of contagious illness or gas exposure that had caused disorientation and wandering, an idea abandoned once no bodies were ever discovered anywhere in the surrounding forest or hills, despite weeks of organized searches. The third theory, quietly discussed but never officially recorded, involved some kind of coordinated crime, though investigators could never identify a single motive, suspect, or piece of physical evidence to support it. Ethan was questioned more times than any child his age should ever have to be questioned, by sheriffs, by state investigators, by 2 different psychiatrists brought in from the nearest city, all of them working from the same basic assumption, that a traumatized 7-year-old boy had witnessed something violent and simply could not process it correctly, and that with enough patience, the real story would eventually surface from underneath the fantastical one he kept repeating. But Ethan's story never changed. Not in 60 years, not under any amount of gentle prompting or outright pressure. He always described the same knock, the same borrowed voices, the same doors opening quietly across the valley, and the same grandfather standing silent against their own front door until morning. Investigators eventually stopped recording his statements altogether, not because they had grown more credible, but because after enough repetition without change, even the most skeptical detectives in the room began to feel an unease they couldn't quite explain either. We're just getting into the deepest part of this mystery, so if you haven't already, now's a great time to hit that subscribe button, because the next part of Ethan's story is where everything starts to connect. The case of Millbrook Hollow might have faded into rural legend entirely, one more unsolved oddity in a county full of them, if not for a discovery made almost 11 years later by a graduate researcher named Daniel Whitcomb, who was cataloging old county records for an entirely unrelated academic project on Appalachian settlement patterns. Buried within a box of nearly illegible ledgers from a neighboring township, Daniel found a reference to an almost identical disappearance dating back 31 years before Millbrook Hollow vanished, in a smaller settlement less than 20 miles away, a town that had similarly emptied overnight, leaving behind only one surviving child and an identical, baffling lack of any bodies, forced entry, or physical evidence. Daniel, intrigued rather than deterred by how strange the parallel was, spent the following 2 years quietly digging through regional archives, church records, and old newspaper morgues across 3 counties. And what he found unsettled him more with every discovery. Millbrook Hollow was not an isolated event. It was, as best he could reconstruct from fragmented and often deliberately vague records, the 4th documented disappearance of its kind in that same general region over roughly 120 years, each one separated from the last by almost exactly 3 decades, and each one leaving behind exactly one surviving child who insisted, against all official skepticism, that voices belonging to loved ones had called them to open a door on the worst night of their lives. When Daniel eventually tracked Ethan down, by then a grown man in his late 30s living quietly at the edge of the very same valley, Ethan agreed to speak with him only after Daniel showed him the earlier case file from 31 years before his own. For the first time in his adult life, someone had brought him proof, real documented proof, that he was neither the first child this had happened to, nor, he now understood with a mixture of relief and dread, likely to be the last. It was during these conversations with Daniel that Ethan finally opened the locked drawer in his grandfather's old writing desk, the one he had been forbidden from touching his entire childhood, and found inside it a journal written in his grandfather's own hand, describing in careful, deliberate detail everything Elias Whitfield had learned about the presence the old-timers called the Ashwalker, and exactly what it would take, if it ever came calling again, to survive the night it did. If you've made it this far into the story, drop a comment letting us know what you think is really behind these disappearances, because we're about to get into the part of this story that changes everything. According to the journal, which Daniel Whitcomb would later spend years attempting to verify against older regional folklore with limited success, the presence was never a singular malevolent force in the way ghost stories typically describe one. It was something closer to a very old, very patient hunger, one that could not act directly against a person, only through invitation freely given. It could not break a lock, it could not shatter a window. It could only borrow a voice already known and trusted, and wait, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, until someone on the other side of a door decided, in a moment of love or grief or simple human weakness, to open it anyway. Elias's journal described his own father's experience with it, 30 years before Millbrook Hollow's disappearance, in that smaller township Daniel had first uncovered, and the singular rule Elias had spent his entire adult life trying to protect his family with, the rule Ethan had heard 100 times without ever fully understanding its weight, until it was almost too late to matter. Elias had survived that earlier night as a young man precisely because his own father had refused to open their door no matter whose voice called from outside, a refusal that ultimately cost his father his own place inside the home when the sun rose and the voices demanded one final price before releasing whatever hold they held on the family that dared to resist them. The journal suggested, though never stated outright, that Elias's own disappearance on the night Millbrook Hollow vanished was not simply misfortune, it was payment, a debt inherited across generations, the same debt his own father had likely paid before him, the price extracted from any family strong enough to keep its door closed, while an entire town opened theirs. Ethan read this final entry, written in his grandfather's increasingly shaking handwriting only days before the disappearance, more times than he could count over the following years, because it ended not with an explanation, but with a warning addressed directly to him. It said simply, "If it comes again in your lifetime, you will already know every voice it tries to use against you. Trust nothing you love more than the silence on the other side of a closed door." Before we get to how this story truly ends, and it does end, in a way you will not expect, make sure you've subscribed. Because what Ethan experienced decades later, in that same farmhouse, is the part of this story he has never told anyone until now. For decades after Daniel Whitcomb's research quietly confirmed what Ethan had always known to be true, life continued in the ordinary, unremarkable way that life continues even after the extraordinary has touched it directly. Ethan married, briefly, though the marriage did not survive his refusal to ever explain why certain nights of the year left him sleepless and pacing the length of his farmhouse floor. He never had children of his own, a choice he has said, in the only interview he ever agreed to give on the subject, was made deliberately, out of a fear he could never fully shake, that whatever debt his family carried might simply be waiting for the next generation to collect. He rebuilt his grandfather's farmhouse plank by plank at the edge of the valley where Millbrook Hollow once stood, and he kept, every single year without exception, the same ritual his grandfather had once kept before him, checking the same windows, respecting the same rule, waiting through the same anniversary each autumn, with a patience that had calcified, over 60 years, into something closer to duty than fear. Then, 3 weeks before this interview was recorded, on the exact date marking 30 years since Daniel Whitcomb first came to his door, with proof that he had never been alone in his experience, Ethan heard a knock on his own front door, late at night, in a voice he had not heard in 60 years, calling him by the same childhood nickname only one person in this world had ever used, a person who had been gone since the night Millbrook Hollow itself disappeared. Ethan did not open that door. He sat with his back against it until morning, the same way his grandfather once had, and when the sun rose, the voice was gone, and an old, familiar quiet had settled back over the valley, at least for now. Ethan agreed to share his story publicly for the first time, specifically because of that night, because he understood, with a certainty that had taken him 60 years and one final knock to fully accept, that the 30-year cycle his grandfather's journal described has not ended, and that somewhere out there, whether in this valley or another one entirely, another family, another child, another closed door, is likely standing between an ordinary night and the same choice Ethan's grandfather once made for him. He does not know if he will hear that voice again before the years finally catch up with him. He only knows that if he does, he intends to do exactly what was done for him, once, a very long time ago, by a grandfather who never got the chance to explain why until it was already too late. So we'll leave you with the same question Ethan has carried with him for 60 years. If a voice you loved and trusted completely called to you from the other side of a locked door in the middle of the night, certain beyond any doubt that it was really them, would you have the strength to leave that door closed until morning? Let us know what you think down in the comments below. And if this story kept you on the edge of your seat from beginning to end, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, because we have another story coming very soon that we think you are not going to want to miss.